project. So we've had quite a number of discussions within the Living Systematic Review Network about what is the difference between an update to a review, or when you would do an update and when you would do a Living Systematic Review. So for those of you who are familiar with some of the questions that you might ask yourself when you update a systematic review, you'll see that there's a lot of overlap with the questions about when to do a living systematic review. But what we're really talking about is the degree of sort of importance or priority, the degree of uncertainty, and the degree of this idea of sort of emerging evidence, particularly in trial registers, that you know is coming through, that is likely to impact on what we know. So the questions that we're suggesting should ideally all be met for a living systematic review is that it's a high priority or emerging question for policy and practice. There is some kind of important uncertainty in what we know already, and that we think the emerging evidence, we're quite sure that that is coming through, and we think it's quite likely to impact on what we currently know. The other thing to bear in mind about when to do a living systematic review is that there are some pragmatic considerations, so that you and your network of contributors have got the capacity and the resources, the funding, the people to sustain an ongoing systematic review commitment. And I think it's interesting at this point to just, I'm not going to talk about this in great detail, but to remember that living systematic reviews, I guess just like systematic reviews, can exist as part of something bigger. So we're not just talking about a living systematic review where you rerun the searches and produce a new review every month and it just sits on a website or sits in a journal. That once you've got a living systematic review or some living evidence synthesis, it opens the door for living clinical practice guidelines, living decision support systems, and this whole loop of evidence into practice, which can happen much more quickly. So we are definitely seeing a lot of interest and enthusiasm in living systematic reviews because of that capacity to feed more quickly into guidelines, particularly in areas that are uncertain. So this is sort of a whole nother talk in itself, but just a really interesting idea, I suppose, to remember that what happens with a living review is you can get sort of living evidence products.